Hello, bearded bee people. Welcome back to B&K Bees. Today I'm going to chat about early spring beekeeping, the things you have to keep in mind, the things you have to do to keep your bees alive through these next couple of weeks until we're truly out of the woods when the weather warms up and the nectar starts flowing. So if you are curious and you're super anxious about keeping your bees alive these next couple of weeks, stay tuned. I hope this video will help answer quite a lot of the questions that you may have and give you some good advice as to how to keep your bees alive so that you have some bees flying around in April. Okay, so just for some clarity, I am mostly talking about Michigan beekeepers here, but you can sort of adapt this for your own region based on where you're at in relation to Michigan. But we're talking about early March right now. I think it's March 4th, and there are a lot of posts on the internet about however many they think that they made through the winter. 8 out of 10 made it through the winter, and there are some other more dire ones, but my point here is that it's a little early at this point to be talking about however many you think made it through, unless they're crazy heavy and they've got a really, really sizable population.
Because I just found out that I'm f***ing immortal!
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a big deal.
Now, I've had a lot of people question as to how my bees are doing throughout the winter, and to answer that really briefly, I have no idea. I am confident in what I do in October, and I set them and I forget them until March or so. Now, normally at this point, I would have at least made my rounds through a couple of the yards to clear out dead bees and to see if anything had gone wrong in terms of blown over covers or any bear damage or anything like that. But I'm in the Upper Peninsula now. We're in the process of transitioning and moving up here, so I have no idea what's going on with my bees. And I wouldn't go through there trying to figure out exactly how many I had alive at this time, just based on the fact that I don't usually try to get straggler colonies through these last couple of weeks. If they're on a couple of frames of bees and they don't have enough food, then they're likely to die, and I'm okay with that. Obviously, if you have 3 colonies and your hopes are set on having all 3 of them make it through the winter, your mindset might be much different. Or maybe you just don't have the level of confidence that I do in what you did during the fall, just based on the fact that you're a little bit less experienced as a beekeeper. Well, there are some things that you can do for your bees, and there are also some things that you can do that will hinder their ability to make it through these next couple of weeks. And we're going to chat about those things here. So, are your bees out of the woods, figuratively speaking? Are they survivors? Well, in early March, like I said, it's a little bit early to definitely say that your bees are survivors. I don't necessarily suggest a whole lot of getting into your bees to figure that out. In terms of checking to see if your bees need anything, I think the only type of introjection that you should be doing are lifting up the backs of the hives to see how much they have in terms of overall weight and pulling dead bees out of the entrance. Other than that, anything that you do can really truly only hinder them, and the ability that you have to fix any problems that may exist is really, really limited at this time of year. So my advice is don't be cracking boxes, don't be lifting covers off of the hives. Just lift the back of the hive up, see if it's light. If it is, then you should probably do something. If it's not, then you should just not worry about them at all. And then go to the lower entrance and just grab a stick out of the woods or whatever, and pull some dead bees out of the entrance if there are dead bees there clogging it up. If not, just walk away. I mean, yeah, you can knock on it in here or walk out there on a sunny day, which is a better idea, and see if they're flying. But like I said, if they're dead, they're dead. If they're not dead, then the only thing you need to know is, do they have enough food? You can't do anything about the population level at this time of year. The only thing you can really do is supplement their food. And in terms of winter feeding, I don't usually have a lot of faith that that is truly effective until about this portion of the year. And what I mean by that is, if your hives are light in January, I don't know that there's a whole lot you can do. I've heard some people, like a buddy of mine, Cy Huff, who watches these videos, hi Cy, he's talked about having the ability, or he did at one point in the past, keep a colony alive through dry sugar feeding alone for quite a few months, but the chances of that happening successfully are really, really low. So like I said, don't get into your colonies quite yet. Don't be digging the frames out. Let the temperatures rise a little bit more. Let the nights stop freezing before we really start getting in there and start feeding any liquid syrup. If they are light and it is early March or just generally not warm enough to feed liquid syrup, and by that I mean it's freezing at night still, then dry sugar is really the only thing you can do. And in that case, you can make a sugar brick, which is sort of complicated, or you can do a mountain cap method by just pouring sugar on top of a newspaper on top of the frames, or just pouring it on the inner cover. Any semblance of dry sugar inside the hive up above the cluster will help, although its ability to truly sustain a colony, a sizable colony, through any real chunk of time is pretty limited. So once again, if they're incredibly light, you've got a bunch of cold weather ahead, the chances of sustaining them on dry sugar alone are pretty low. And if they do die in this case, then you really do have to go back and just amend your schedule, feed more in the fall, make sure that all of your colonies have exactly what it takes to make you feel confident for them to go through the winter and have enough food to make it through. If you did pop the top and your bees are a really small cluster, like they're alive, but they're really small, you really do have to ask yourself why that is the case. If they went into winter as just a massive colony and came out, a 15th or a 20th of the overall size, viruses and mites are probably a cause. And in that case, when you do get the ability to get into your bees, it's advantageous to do a mite wash. It's advantageous to look for deformed wings, to look for mites on these bees, because I always say don't look for mites on the bees and use that as an indication of your mite load. But early spring in overwintered colonies, the mite to bee ratio can be so crazy high because over the winter, as these bees die, these mites will find other bees to attach to, and you can have 2 or 3 mites on each individual bee. If that's the case, once again, these bees are probably on their way out, and that's an unfortunate thing, and I hate to be the bearer of that bad news. But once again, in that case, you really do have to go back and amend your treatment schedule and just make sure that you're sending healthy bees into that next winter, and you're likely to have a lot more success and to not see these massive colonies become so depleted over the course of the winter. Once the freezing weather is largely done, we have the ability to start getting into our colonies and assessing where they're at and what they need. The vast majority of colonies can benefit from some early spring feeding, even if they have some stored honey. Capped honey is not usually something that the bees like to use to build up. It's more of an emergency resource. So if you only have capped honey in your overwintered colonies, it's truly advantageous to put out some food. So once again, wait until the nights are done freezing before you start to offer communal syrup. But that is the way I recommend feeding your bees generally in early spring. This will get the bees out and used to flying around in the spring weather to forage, and it'll also give all of your bees a little bit of food, but not so much to where they start to clog the brood nest before you have the ability to start adding boxes and honey supers. And it also is just a really easy time of year to feed communally because the level or the threat of robbing is so very low. Now, if you have colonies that are very light, like extremely light, then you really do have to feed them specifically. And I call that spot feeding. And in that case, I would put a frame replacement feeder inside the hive or give them some kind of food inside the hive, whether through like a hive top feeder or some other method to where you know it's going to that hive and that hive alone, because these weakened and depleted hives have less of an ability to grab all that communal food before the healthier and larger ones get their share. As far as feeding pollen is concerned, early spring is a great time to supplement your bees' protein. There is some threat in this, and that is the bees use the incoming protein, the incoming pollen, as a gauge as to what portion of the year they're in. The earliest protein will instigate a brooding of the colony and will really bring them out of winter mode and into spring mode. If you jump the gun and start giving them protein before nature starts offering it, you can get these bees to brood up so much that some erratic weather will get some chilled brood and some dead bees. So that can be dangerous, and my advice in that case is to just wait until these plants around you are offering pollen before you start to supplement. And for that, here in Michigan, we wait for the maples to start blooming. When you're at the portion of the year when you can start really digging into these colonies, it's warm enough during the day and not freezing at night, the same criteria that exists for feeding your bees liquid syrup, at that point we can start manipulating the boxes. In a lot of cases, bees do diminish to some extent over the course of the winter. All of the summer bees that went into the winter cluster are going to die over the course of the winter. So you're likely to have a smaller cluster in March and April than you did in September. And if that is the case, then it can be advantageous at this earliest portion of the year to downsize the hive. Like if they went into winter as a double and are only in a portion of the upper box, remove that second box and add it later when they need it. If they went into winter as a double and are occupying the majority of the top box but none of the lower box, you can reverse them. Now be careful in this case, because if they do have a little patch of brood in that lower box and you reverse them, you just put a big space of emptiness in between the brood areas, which can once again result in chilled brood, which is a bad thing to have happen, especially in early spring when the threat of bacterial infections like European foul brood is so high. If your bees came out and look great and they're not really diminished in size all that much and they're filling out a majority of their overall brood area, get those boxes on them sooner rather than later. These bees, once again, are ready to take off in the spring and they're ready to build up quickly. And as soon as that communal feed starts coming in and then those dandelions start popping out amongst the green grass, they're going to build up quickly and you are likely to get behind before you even really got started. So if you think that they're occupying 70 or 80% of their overall brood area, you're in there early in spring and you're feeding and you're expecting dandelions to start popping out pretty soon, then really truly just put a box on them. It's not going to give them too much space. They're still going to stay clustered around their brood area. But when they do start to expand, they're going to have some area to expand into and give you a little bit of time so that you can get all the rest of the stuff done before you need to start pulling frames for splits. One thing you might notice is the hive being a little gross. Like I said, all of the summer bees that go into a winter cluster are going to die over the course of the winter. And then there are also going to likely be other casualties to cold or other reasons that gross stuff is going to accumulate, like mold and sometimes poop on the inside of the hive. Now, some of these things are concerning and some of them are not, but either way, it's a good idea to, at least to some extent, clean up your hives as you get into them for those first couple of times. Now, the things you definitely should do are scrape the bottom board of all of the wax cappings and all the dead bees and moldy grossness. And if there are any frames with dead bees in them, you can try to brush them off. Don't worry too much about dead bees stuck in cells or mold on the frames. The bees themselves will clean that stuff up far better than you can, and mold is a natural part of a bee colony's existence. It's not something that you should be concerned about. If you see poop on the inside of the hive in any appreciable way, like you've got a couple of frames that are really grossly covered with a lot of bee poop, that can be a sign of something gross. In most cases, it's a sign of digestive problems with plant solids over the course of a long period of winter cold. Where they couldn't get out and take cleansing flights. A lot of people will talk about nosema when we're talking about bee poop on and in the hive, but in reality, Nosema ceranae, the Asian version, has taken over here in the US, and poop is not a symptom of Nosema ceranae. Now, that does not mean that this poop is not a sign of some type of bacterial grossness or problem on the inside of the hive. So if you do have poop-affected frames, I say just throw them away. It's a $2 investment, and those bees will recreate that comb so quickly during the build-up portion of the year that you'll barely even notice them being gone. So if they're covered with poop, scrape them off, clean them with a pressure washer, throw them away, just completely. Do whatever it takes to get that stuff out of the hive. You really don't want any threat of bacterial problems in early spring. Now, I'm sure none of you guys lost any bees this winter because we're all perfect, awesome beekeepers. But if you did lose them, there is the crappy, gross job of cleaning out deadouts that you do have to do. Now, once again, a lot of the stuff that seems gross is just absolutely fine to use with future bees. If it's covered with mold or if it's got dead bees that are stuck in the cells, don't worry about it. The bees will clean that stuff up. Your future bees that you install these frames into will clean those things up very quickly and very, very effectively. The only things that you really should make sure you avoid giving to new bees are any obviously disease-affected frames or any frames that are grossly affected with a lot of poop on the inside of the hive. Those have to go, but any mold and dead bee stuff can go into your new colonies. Those new bees will clean it up and make it look perfect. As you're going through these deadouts, it is advantageous to try to diagnose what contributed to these bees' demise. Now, I have said this probably 200 times on this channel, but if you did not know what your mite load was going into winter, you have to consider mites the #1 suspect. I mean, there are so many threads, and I just the other day had to just go away from one because it's so difficult convincing these new beekeepers that mites killed their bees when they want to believe that it was something out of their control. They wanted to believe that it was a wild temperature swing in January that killed their bees, or this uncontrollable system of moisture that kept dripping on their bees that killed them, when they didn't know what the mite load was, and they're going to go into this next year making sure that there's no moisture in the colony, but taking no effort to make sure that their bees are healthy, and then they'll figure out a new thing to blame next year. So, if you didn't know what your mite load was, or if you only treated once or twice without testing after you treated, then you have to be able to consider the mites the #1 suspect. Now, I promise you, if you can get over the difficult aspect of that, if you can get over the fact that it's troubling that there was something you could have done to keep your bees alive, then you are going to keep more bees alive. You're going to make better decisions going forward and keep healthier bees. So please try to be humble. Try to realize that you made a mistake as a beginning beekeeper, and you can rectify that mistake and be a better beekeeper for having made it. So if you don't know what your mite count was, consider mites a possible cause of your bees' demise. Now, if your bees had no food, and there's not a massive cloud of, or massive pile of wax cappings all over the bottom board and outside of the front of the hive, then it's likely that your bees starved. And that's another thing that you can do better going forward and make sure that you have healthy bees going forward if you try to rectify that. So you can rectify that by feeding more and feeding earlier in the spring, or taking less honey, or doing anything that you think will give these bees a better chance to be more efficient with their food going through their winter. If you have the ability to take these boxes off of the bottom board before you break these frames free, that'll give you the ability to look at the bottom board as it looked to those bees. Now, if you go through the top box and then go through the bottom box and then look at the bottom board, you're going to have a lot of stuff and bees fall to that bottom board, and that won't be how it looked as that cluster was going through winter. So if you can possibly just remove those boxes and set them to the side and inspect the bottom board first, that will give you the ability to see if there were a crazy amount of dead mites, or a crazy amount of, as I had said a second ago, wax cappings that would indicate a robbing situation that might have contributed to that colony having less of an ability to survive. And it also might show you the fact that there are a bunch of bees that had fallen dead on the front part of the hive, the sunny part of the hive, which might indicate to you that they were in fact a little bit cold and they were clustered in this one warmer section of the box, which might give you an ability to better overwinter in years going forward. So once again, if you have the ability to remove those boxes without affecting those frames or having anything fall to the bottom board, that'll give you a great ability to see some likely signs of things that could contribute to those bees' death. If you thought that there was any type of problem in the fall, That problem probably had something to do with those bees dying. If it was disease, if it was a population that wasn't quite as strong as you thought you needed, or wasn't as strong as it was a few weeks before the last inspection, then those issues, those things that contributed to that issue, probably contributed to those bees dying over the course of the winter. So take those into account when you're diagnosing these deadouts. Other than the bottom board inspection, make sure that you check the entrance areas. If there's a crazy amount of poop all over the entrance areas and inside your hive, you might have had a digestive problem. That could have been because of plant solid heavy honey late in the fall, which is a common contributor to digestive problems over the course of the winter. Or it could have been a result of some gross syrup you fed them. Maybe it was fermented, or you had heated it too much and altered the sugar compounds in the syrup. Either way, it's a good thing to make sure you look for all these signs of possible digestive problems or possible disease before you get into the actual frames looking at the cluster itself. When you do get into the hive and you start looking at each individual frame, you're going to want to be paying attention to how much food is in there, where it was located, how these bees look, what kind of cluster size was there in comparison to the amount of bees that went into winter in the first place. Do these bees have healthy looking wings? If they have K-wing or deformed wings, then that's a likely sign of virus, which can be caused by mites. In deformed wings, it's always caused by mites, but in some other viruses, it might be another issue. Either way, sign of unhealthy wings is a sign of virus problems in your colony. So if you see any of these things, you can do your own research to figure out exactly what it is you can do better to make sure that you keep healthier bees. And figuring out that it was likely some long dead virus or food or mites or something will give you the confidence in using those frames and equipment for future bees. Because if it was the rare case of some really bad pathogen like American foul brood, it's really, really important that we correctly diagnose that and not put new bees into that equipment. So make sure that you're going through this deadout with an analytical mindset. Look for poop, look for unhealthy wings, look for the amount of food and where it's at, look for signs of robbing, which would be indicated by piles of wax cappings on the bottom board and the entrance and outside on the ground around the hive. All of these things are signs of something that could have contributed to your bee's death, but in the vast majority of cases, as I've said, with beginning beekeepers, mites played some part. So if your bees died and you are in any way questioning whether you had a high mite load or what your mite load was, or whether you had done enough in terms of your mite load over the course of the year, you really should be considering that as a likely contributor to your bee's death. Now that we're done talking about mites and why bees died, we can talk about something a little bit happier, and that is planning on splitting your overwintered colonies. Overwintered bees are a ticking time bomb in terms of when they are going to swarm. It's not a question of if they're going to, it's just a question of when. This queen has already experienced a build-up portion of the year, so she is dead set on swarming, and once again, as soon as they get enough sheets of open brood and there's nectar coming into the hive and the population is sizable enough to warrant a swarm, they are going to start creating cells and you are going to see your bees in the trees. So you have to start planning your splitting as soon as you start getting into these colonies and seeing what they look like. If they're all greatly diminished, then you probably have a considerable amount of time and some boxes to add before these bees are really truly ready to swarm. But if you've done a really good job and you have some really good looking colonies coming out of winter, that time is coming soon. So start to plan it, start to prepare the boxes, start to prepare the areas that you're going to set out the splits, start to think about how you're going to get queens into these splits, whether you're going to let these queenless groups of bees create their own queens, or maybe you're going to purchase queen cells or queens from a local breeder. Either way, these things should start to be planned as soon as you start to see bees in the spring, because that amount of time may seem like a lot here in early March, thinking about splitting in early May, but that time goes by quickly, and a lot of things that are unexpected can happen in the interim that really throw our schedule off. So as soon as you start seeing bees in the spring, start thinking about the splits that are going to come from them. How many frames are you going to pull? What size are you going to try to get all your colonies down to? Are you going to run doubles or singles? If you're going to run singles, then usually I take them down to about 6 frames of brood and bees. But either way, try to figure that stuff out as soon as you can, because that time between getting into your, because there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. Swarming, great idea. Seems like a long time, like I said, but it goes to consider what size you want. As I said, whether you're gonna run a double or a single, and to try to get your yards down to that uniform size in this spring splitting round. It makes it a lot easier for uniform treatment of all of your different beekeeping management things if all of your colonies are generally the same size and generally need the same things when you're going out to your bee yards. Like I said, I like to bring my singles, my colonies that will go through the winter or go through the bee year as singles, down to about 6 frames of brood and bees. It may seem like a great depletion of the overall numbers, but man, like I said, they build up quickly, and if I leave them with 6 frames of brood, that's going to be a full single in need of a honey box right in time with the incoming nectar. So plan how large you want your colonies to be. Try to get them all down to that uniform size during your round of spring splits. And during this planning portion of the year, make sure that you've got all of your equipment set out, because when stuff starts happening and those drones start flying, you are going to need to be pulling those frames out quickly. Okay, so I hope that that was a good rundown of the things I have in my mind in terms of early spring beekeeping. I'm going to make some other videos on some of these things specifically, like feeding and preparing your splits and planning your bee year out. But either way, I hope that this answers some of your questions as to what you should be doing now for your bees and the things that you're going to have to be doing over the course of the next couple of weeks. Once again, please don't be out there pulling your frames out when it's going to get to 30 degrees the next night, or it has any threat of freezing over the course of the next few days, because this is all stuff that these bees are going to try to repair. If we're pulling these frames out, cooling them, when we put them back, these bees have to warm it back up. They've got to repropolize everything together. They have to repair the things that we damaged when we got in there. And once again, there's not a whole lot of good things you can do for your bees at this time of year. So if you have any questions, any particular issues that I didn't clarify, or something specific in your yard that is just driving you nuts, or that you don't know how to go about, leave your question in the comment section below. I'll be happy to chat with you there. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. If you want to see other videos as they come out in the future, click subscribe. But once again, like I said, thank you very much for being here. Get out there and have some fun with your bees. See ya.